Greetings, dear friends, as we traverse this vast, mysterious planet. We often look outward, pointing fingers, labeling systems, ideologies, or individuals as evil. But I ask you today, have we paused long enough to truly understand what constitutes the greatest evil on this planet? It is not lurking in dark alleys, nor hidden in the shadows of distant lands. The greatest evil resides in our own hearts and minds, unnoticed, unchecked, and often invited in. The root of what we often label as evil lies not in external forces but within ourselves. It is born out of the ignorance and unconsciousness that permeate our thoughts, actions, and interactions. When we lack awareness, we fail to see the interconnectedness of all life. This blindness leads to decisions and behaviors that create harm not because we are inherently malicious, but because we are disconnected from the consequences of our actions. Think about it. Every great harm inflicted on humanity, whether by individuals or societies, began with a thought, an intention, or a belief that was not questioned or examined. It is not monstrous beings who perpetuate evil. It is ordinary people who allow unconscious patterns to dominate their lives. The cruelty we see in the world often mirrors the unaddressed fears, insecurities, and desires within our own minds. Consider how often we justify our actions by convincing ourselves they are necessary or unavoidable. This self-deception can blind us to the pain we cause others, allowing harmful cycles to continue. Whether it's anger, jealousy, greed, or hatred, these emotions, when left unchecked, become the seeds of suffering. They grow into words and actions that ripple outward, creating discord and destruction. We tend to externalize evil, attributing it to specific people, systems, or ideologies. But what if we shifted our focus inward and asked, how am I contributing to this? This isn't about self-blame, but about self-awareness. When we become conscious of the darkness within us, we gain the power to transform it. Recognizing our capacity for harm allows us to cultivate the opposite: kindness, compassion, and understanding. The greatest harm arises not from deliberate malice, but from the absence of thought, from living without awareness of how deeply interconnected we are. The root of evil, therefore, is not a force we must battle in the outside world, but a lack of light within us. The antidote to this is not punishment or retaliation, it is awakening, understanding, and the courage to change. Apathy and indifference are among the most insidious forces that perpetuate harm in the world. They thrive in silence, allowing suffering to go unchecked and injustices to persist. It is not always the loud, visible acts of violence or malice that cause the greatest damage. Often, it is the quiet refusal to act, to care, or to acknowledge the struggles of others that leaves the deepest scars. When we see suffering or wrongdoing and choose to turn away, we participate in its continuation. It is not necessary to actively inflict harm to contribute to it. Standing by doing nothing is often enough. Apathy dulls the senses, numbs the heart, and convinces us that the problems of the world are not ours to bear. It whispers that someone else will step in, that the issues are too vast, or that our contributions are too small to make a difference. But what if we pause to consider the true cost of indifference? Every moment of silence in the face of injustice becomes a brick in the wall of oppression. Every shrug of the shoulders when confronted with suffering adds weight to the burden of those already struggling. When we choose not to see, not to speak, or not to act, we inadvertently allow the seeds of harm to grow unchecked. Indifference does not always come from malice, it often arises from a sense of helplessness or overwhelm. The problems of the world can feel so immense that they paralyze us. But the truth is, no act of care, no gesture of compassion is ever too small. A kind word, a listening ear, or a willingness to stand with someone in their time of need can shift the balance. It is in these seemingly small acts that the antidote to apathy begins to take root. The danger of apathy lies in its invisibility. It cloaks itself in neutrality, convincing us that doing nothing is harmless. But doing nothing in the face of suffering is not neutrality, it is complicity. To care, to act, to choose to engage with the pain of the world is not just an act of compassion, it is an act of courage. In the absence of this courage, apathy becomes a silent enabler of harm. Greed and possessiveness are forces that have shaped the trajectory of human history, often with devastating consequences. At its core, greed stems from a deep-seated sense of lack of belief that what we have, who we are, or where we stand is never enough. This insatiable yearning for more drives us to accumulate, hoard, and control, often at the expense of others and the world around us. The allure of greed lies in its promise the idea that possessing more, be it wealth, power, or resources, will bring fulfillment, security, or happiness. Yet it is a promise that remains perpetually unfulfilled. The more we acquire, the greater our hunger becomes, as greed does not satisfy it, it inflames. In this relentless pursuit, we become blind to the needs of others and even to the well-being of the planet that sustains us. Consider the impact of unchecked greed on our world. Natural resources are exploited without regard for future generations. Communities are torn apart as individuals and corporations prioritize profit over people. Even relationships are strained when possessiveness takes hold, reducing love and connection to mere transactions. Greed creates a cycle of consumption and competition, where the focus shifts from thriving together to outpacing one another. What makes greed particularly destructive is that it often disguises itself as ambition or progress. It encourages us to justify our actions, convincing ourselves that the pursuit of more is not only acceptable but necessary. In the process, we lose sight of balance, fairness, and the true essence of what it means to live a fulfilling life. Greed thrives on comparison, urging us to measure our worth against others, leading to envy, resentment, and endless dissatisfaction. Possessiveness, a close companion to greed, deepens this harm. It fosters a mindset of ownership rather than stewardship, making us cling tightly to what we have and fear its loss. This fear feeds into conflict, as we view others not as fellow travelers on this journey of life, but as threats to what we hold dear. The need to control and dominate becomes a barrier to genuine connection and shared growth. Yet, the antidote to greed is not deprivation. It is contentment. It is the realization that true abundance is not found in what we take, but in what we give and share. When we shift our focus from accumulation to contribution, from possession to participation, we begin to break free from the grip of greed. We rediscover a sense of harmony not just with others, but with the world as a whole. Separation and division are among the most pervasive forces driving conflict and suffering in the world. At its core, the perception of separation arises from the idea that we are fundamentally isolated from one another, different, independent, and apart. This belief shapes our thoughts, actions, and relationships, creating barriers where there should be bridges. It blinds us to the reality that life is interconnected, that we are all strands in the same intricate web of existence. This sense of division often begins subtly. It is instilled in the way we identify ourselves by nationality, race, religion, gender, or class. While these identities can provide a sense of belonging, they can also create a sense of us versus them. This binary thinking divides the world into opposing camps where differences are magnified and commonalities are ignored. It becomes easy to dehumanize those who do not fit within the narrow confines of our group. Division does not only exist on a global or societal level, it manifests in our daily lives. We draw lines between ourselves and others based on opinions, lifestyles, or choices, often judging or dismissing those who do not align with our own perspectives. These divisions are reinforced by fear, the fear of the unknown, the unfamiliar, or the misunderstood. Fear convinces us to protect what is ours and defend against perceived threats, even when none truly exist. The consequences of this mindset are profound. Wars are fought, communities are fractured, and relationships are destroyed, all in the name of maintaining these artificial boundaries. Even our relationship with the natural world suffers from this sense of separation. We see ourselves as separate from the earth, exploiting its resources without recognizing that its well-being is inseparable from our own. The illusion of separation blinds us to the deeper truth, that we are not isolated entities but interconnected parts of a larger whole. Just as the rivers flow into the ocean and the roots of trees intertwine beneath the soil, our lives are deeply linked. What happens to one inevitably affects the other. When we harm another, we ultimately harm ourselves. Overcoming the division requires a shift in perception, a willingness to see beyond the labels and categories that define us. It calls for an acknowledgement of our shared humanity and our shared responsibility. By recognizing the threads that connect us, we begin to dissolve the boundaries that divide us. We learn to approach others with curiosity instead of judgment, with compassion instead of fear. In this recognition, the illusion of separation begins to fade, and the possibility of unity and understanding emerges. Fear and insecurity are forces that operate quietly, yet they have the power to shape our actions, relationships, and even the trajectory of our lives. At its core, Fear is a primal response, an instinctive mechanism designed to protect us from danger. But when left unchecked, fear evolves into something far more insidious, weaving itself into the fabric of our thoughts and decisions. It no longer serves as a shield against immediate threats, but becomes a barrier that isolates us from growth, connection, and possibility. Insecurity, often born from fear, takes root in our perception of self. It whispers that we are not enough, that we lack the strength, beauty, intelligence, or worth to stand confidently in the world. This internalized doubt creates a constant need to seek validation, control, or approval, often at the expense of others. We start comparing ourselves, competing unnecessarily, or clinging to what we have, afraid that it might slip away. The real danger of fear and insecurity lies in how they manifest externally. When fear dominates our minds, it can make us defensive, aggressive, or overly cautious. We erect walls, both literal and metaphorical, believing they will keep us safe. But these walls also keep us isolated. Fear fosters suspicion and division, making it easy to view others as threats rather than allies. It fuels prejudice, leading us to judge or reject what we do not understand. Insecurity amplifies this, driving us to undermine others to mask our own vulnerabilities. History offers countless examples of how fear has been used to control and manipulate. Leaders have exploited it to justify wars, divisions, and oppression. On a personal level, fear limits our capacity for trust and compassion, convincing us that vulnerability is weakness. It makes us prioritize self-preservation over shared progress, stifling the very qualities that allow us to thrive as individuals and as communities. Yet, despite its grip, fear is not inherently evil. It is a signal, a messenger that something within us seeks attention. The problem arises when we allow fear to dictate our choices rather than inform them. It is not fear itself, but our unwillingness to confront and understand it that gives it power. When we face our fears with courage and self-awareness, we begin to transform them. Fear can teach us about our deepest desires and values, showing us what truly matters. Insecurity, when acknowledged, becomes an opportunity to grow in self-acceptance. By embracing our vulnerabilities, we reclaim the power that fear and insecurity have taken from us. We learn to act not out of avoidance, but out of intention, creating lives built on strength, connection, and authenticity. Lack of awareness is one of the most pervasive and underestimated forces behind much of the suffering in the world. It is not an active force like hatred or greed, but a passive absence, a failure to see, understand, or acknowledge the full reality of our actions and their consequences. When we move through life unconsciously, we operate on autopilot, driven by habits, assumptions, and unexamined beliefs. This lack of awareness disconnects us from the present moment, from others, and even from ourselves. When we are unaware, we become blind to the impact of our choices. We might act out of convenience, tradition, or self-interest without considering the ripple of our effects on those around us or the environment. A careless word spoken in haste can wound deeply. A thoughtless action, no matter how small, can contribute to larger cycles of harm. Yet because we are not attuned to these consequences, we fail to take responsibility, allowing harm to perpetuate unchecked. Lack of awareness also limits our ability to connect with others. When we are caught up in our own concerns, we may fail to notice the struggles or needs of those around us. This disconnection fosters isolation, misunderstanding, and division. Empathy requires presence, a willingness to truly see and feel the reality of another person's experience. Without awareness, this depth of connection becomes impossible. On a larger scale, a lack of awareness perpetuates systemic issues. Environmental destruction, social inequality, and conflict often stem from a failure to recognize the interconnectedness of life. We exploit natural resources as if they are infinite, ignoring the long-term consequences. We perpetuate systems of inequality because we are unaware of or choose to ignore the suffering they cause. This unawareness is not always intentional. Often it is the result of being caught in routines, distractions, or inherited patterns of thinking. The antidote to lack of awareness is mindfulness and self-inquiry. Awareness begins with a willingness to pause, to observe, and to question. It is the ability to step back and see the bigger picture, to understand how our thoughts, emotions, and actions influence the world around us. Awareness is not about perfection or constant vigilance, it is about cultivating a state of openness and curiosity. When we become aware, we unlock the potential for change. We see where harm is being done and can choose a different path. We notice where compassion is needed and can extend it. Awareness allows us to break free from unconscious patterns, creating space for intentional and meaningful action. It is not a passive state, but a transformative force, one that illuminates the darkness and reveals the possibilities for growth, healing, and connection. Judgment over understanding is one of the most common ways we close ourselves off from deeper connection and truth. It is a habit that arises almost reflexively as we interpret the world through the lens of our own experiences, biases, and beliefs. When we encounter something unfamiliar, challenging, or different, the tendency is to label it, categorize it, and often dismiss it before we have truly taken the time to understand it. Judgment simplifies the world, reducing complexity into neat, manageable boxes. It allows us to feel certain, to feel right, and to feel in control. But this certainty often comes at a cost. When we judge, we stop listening, we stop questioning, we stop learning. Judgment builds barriers between ourselves and others, creating distance where there could be connection. It prevents us from seeing the full humanity of another person, reducing them to an action, a word, or a single moment that fits our preconceived notions. This habit of judgment is not just directed outward, it also turns inward. We judge ourselves harshly for perceived failures, shortcomings, or mistakes, often holding ourselves to impossible standards. This self-judgment creates shame, guilt, and a sense of inadequacy that can be paralyzing. Instead of motivating us to grow, it keeps us trapped in cycles of self-doubt and fear. Understanding, on the other hand, requires effort and vulnerability. It asks us to set aside our assumptions and approach people and situations with an open mind and heart. Understanding does not mean agreement or approval. It simply means taking the time to see the full picture, to consider the context, and to recognize the complexities that shape every individual and every situation. The world is filled with diversity of thought, culture, belief, and experience. If we rely on judgment, we reduce this richness to stereotypes and oversimplifications. But when we seek understanding, we begin to appreciate the nuances that make each person and perspective unique. We see that behind every action is a story, behind every belief is a journey, and behind every difference is a shared humanity. Judgment often feels easier because it is quick and definitive. Understanding, however, requires patience, curiosity, and humility. It challenges us to confront our own biases and question our own perspectives. It pushes us to look beyond the surface and engage with the deeper truths that lie beneath. When we replace judgment with understanding, we open the door to empathy and compassion. We create space for dialogue, for healing, and for connection. We begin to see that the world is not divided into good and bad, right and wrong, but is instead a tapestry of experiences, each contributing to the greater whole. In choosing understanding over judgment, we not only enrich our own lives, but also contribute to a world where differences are celebrated rather than condemned. As we reflect on the forces that drive division, harm, and suffering, let us remember that the power to change begins within each of us. The greatest transformations in the world do not come from grand declarations or sweeping gestures, but from the quiet, steady work of individuals choosing to live with awareness, understanding, and compassion. When we replace judgment with curiosity, fear with courage, and separation with connection, we become part of a ripple effect that reaches far beyond ourselves. It is not a task for the faint-hearted, but it is one that holds the promise of healing not just for others, but for our own hearts as well. So let us walk through this life with eyes wide open, hearts ready to embrace, and minds willing to learn. In doing so, we not only diminish the forces of harm, but also nurture the light of goodness that resides in us all. The path forward may not always be easy, but it is always within our reach. Thank you